Wow. Wow.
Okay, so I think at 150, I'm gonna start. Okay. So I am Hasia Diner from New York University, and I want to welcome you all to this second session of a remarkable conference, which is sponsored by Jewish Currents. And I would like to take just a few minutes and then turn it over to the moderator and then the panelists. This session, which is entitled 1950s Affluence and Its Discontent, is part of a conference that is being hosted by Jewish Currents with funding from the Goldstein-Gorin Center for American Jewish History at New York University. NYU and the Goldstein-Gorin Center were the original hosts for the series. It was conceived pre-COVID, and yet as a result of that, the contingent faculty at NYU and such contingent faculty across the country have asked fellow academics not to host conferences at institutions whose COVID policies have exacerbated some of the long lingering inequities within higher education. So we, Jewish Currents, graciously offered to be the host, and in solidarity with the contingent faculty's call for conference organizers, the two organizers of this conference, who are not me, but Hadass Binyamini and Natalia Shevin, who are two PhD students at NYU, who conceived of this conference and have worked together with Jewish Currents to make this possible. So my thanks to Jewish Currents and to Hadass and Natalia. We're here to look at the ways in which history and the present and perhaps the future collide, why activists might want to hear historians, why historians may have something really important to learn from people active on the scene right now. So without any more theft of time from me, I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Michelle Chen, who is a contributing writer for The Nation. She also is a contributing editor of Dissent magazine, and also writes for In These Times. She is co-producer of Asia Pacific Forum, the podcast, and Dissents Belabored. She teaches at the Harry Van Arsdale Junior School of Labor Studies at SUNY Empire State College, and she has a PhD from CUNY. So Michelle, please take it over and introduce the speakers.
Thanks everyone for attending, and I'm glad I remembered to unmute myself when I started talking. So thank you all for coming to this panel. It is titled 1950s Affluence and Its Discontents. So in this discussion, we will focus on class and identity throughout the post-war era up to the present day. And we brought together a panel of scholars and activists who have, over their careers, parsed how identity and class have intersected throughout history, how the Jewish experience in post-war America encapsulates a certain type of upward mobility that both affirms and perhaps challenges the ideal of the so-called American dream. And we're going to look at how the acquisition of wealth over the course of one's lifetime or across generations can change how a community sees itself through the lens of ethnicity, race, or class. And each of our panelists has grappled with questions of social mobility in history as well as contemporary times. And given that our audience and the readership of Jewish Currents probably leans towards left and progressive politics, one might wonder why bother talking about rich people for an hour and a half, right? But that's where the discontent part comes in, right? In order to understand the peculiar and often subsurface nature of class and class conflict in America, we have to understand not just the struggle between classes, but also the insecurity, the status anxiety that accompanies social mobility across class lines. So I'm just going to quickly introduce some of our panelists here. We have panelists here who are going to look at broadly how the Jewish community has navigated some of the contradictions that come with social mobility. We'll also examine how the Asian American community has followed a similar trajectory in many ways in terms of ascending class hierarchy, but also experiencing often marginalization and sometimes insecurity as a racial other. And we'll also look at how affluence and social mobility among racial and religious minority communities shape our contemporary political discourse in the era of Trump. Right? Margaret M. Chin is professor of sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center. She is the author of Stuck, Why Asian Americans Don't Reach the Top of the Corporate Ladder, and Sewing Women, a text that I've taught in my own classes. Her specialties include immigrants and their children, work, education, race, ethnicity, and Asian Americans. Nadav David is the New England regional organizer at Resource Generation. With Kavod in Boston, he co-leads a Jews of Color, Indigenous Jews, Sephardim, and Mizrahim caucus, along with Solidarity Economy and Alternatives to Policing projects. He previously worked as a financial coach supporting families living in subsidized housing programs. Rachel Cranston is an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Pittsburgh. She's the author of Ambivalent Embrace, Jewish Upward Mobility in Post-War America, and co-editor of A Jewish Feminine Mystique, Jewish Women in Post-War America. And finally, Rachel Sherman is professor and chair of sociology at the New School. She is the author of Uneasy Street, The Anxieties of Affluence and Class Acts, Service and Inequality in Luxury Hotels. So without further ado, I'll have each of them going in roughly alphabetical order, starting with Margaret, talk a little bit about their work and how it relates to the topic we're discussing today. So Margaret, please take it away.
Well, first, thank you. Thank you for having me. Hasia, thank you, and Jewish Currents. It's a really interesting topic, mostly because I think my work spans from the working class to the middle wealthy class now. I myself am a child of immigrants. My mother was a garment worker and my father was a restaurant worker. And I grew up on the Upper West Side in Manhattan in the projects. So I've seen the world myself as an individual who grew up, I would say, working poor, and now am, I'm not wealthy, but I'm pretty comfortable as a professor. That's what I can say, and working in a public school. So I also see the working class lives of many of the students. And so many of the subjects that I've studied from the my work in the garment factories looks at cross-race and cross-ethnic groups, looking mostly at the poor and looking how different different supports, how they can have different supports, meaning unionization, how it can help them not live paycheck to paycheck. And then when I look at the class at the very top, it's a very interesting, different look at social mobility, but it also tells me, and I'm going to stop right after this, it also tells me that when we look at social mobility, you have to look at where people come from, where they start, and not just where they end, and not just about income too, when we look at social mobility. And of course, race comes into this too, and how it intersects. And I'll stop here and we'll keep talking about the questions a little later on. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nadav?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nadav David. I use he and him pronouns. I'm based in Boston on unceded Massachusetts and Wampanoag land. And I'm calling from a city where the median net wealth of a white family is $247,000. And the median net wealth of a Black family is $8. And that of a Dominican family is $0. So I start there because this work is urgent. It's urgent around COVID, but it's ultimately urgent around an extractive economic system that we are all living in. And I wanted to first start with a couple pieces of framing before I jump into a little bit about my work. So the first being that as we're going through this conversation, I would love for folks on the panel, but also folks who are joining us to think about when we're talking about Jewish people, which Jewish people are we talking about? So around 15 to 20% of Jewish communities in the US identify, or individuals identify as people of color, right? So when we are talking about the growth or the suburbanization or the social mobility of Jewish folks in the US, we want to be really specific when we're talking about white Ashkenazi Eastern European Jews versus Jewish people of color or Middle Eastern North African Jews. So I wanted to start there. And the second thing I wanted to offer, which Margaret actually did so beautifully, so thank you, was to a practice of sharing my own class experience, which comes out of my work at Resource Generation, to break the taboos of talking about class and wealth experience. So myself, I was born in Jerusalem to a cross-class and multi-ethnic parents. My mother's family is Ashkenazi and Jewish. Both of her parents, both of my grandparents on my mom's side are Jewish educators, and their families came to the US in the early 1900s and were able to sort of reach professional class status into the mid 20th century. And my dad's family is Iraqi and Jewish, so I identify as a multi-ethnic Arab Jew, and this really shaped my own experience in seeing the ways in which race and class impact our lives. So I grew up in a professional class family. As I said, I went to private Jewish day school, K through 12, and attended undergraduate degree with no student debt. And my family's money primarily has been accumulated through money in the stock market. My grandparents were both Jewish educators, so they were not in extractive industries, but they were, had access to whiteness in a way that allowed for them to be mobile and to accumulate wealth that then my parents and I have benefited from. And also my dad works in tech in a high income career, which has also meant mobility for my family. So I'll just get into a little bit about Resource Generation. So as Michelle shared, I'm the New England Regional Organizer for Resource Generation. And RG is a multiracial community of young people with access to wealth and or class privilege who are committed to the equitable distribution of wealth, land, and power. And we specifically organize people, our target audience are individuals in the top 10% in terms of income and or assets, their own or their families, though we do have a cross-class community. And we envision a world where communities are powerful, healthy, and living in alignment with the planet, where there's racial and economic justice, and where wealth, land, and power is shared. So the reason we feel like our work is important, especially now, is that we're living through one of the largest or the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in US history. So we're at a particular moment to make change, and not only to push for individual redistribution, of people moving money to social justice organizations that are led by poor and working class people, but actually involuntary or structural redistribution, right? We want to get to a world and to a system where wealthy people and all people are involuntarily redistributing their wealth so that all of us can live healthy and dignified lives. So this looks like about 900 members across the US in 17 chapters, and redistributing millions collectively to local and national organizations, as well as participating in campaigns for systemic change. And I'll just say lastly, that RG is, I think what's really interesting about being on this panel is that RG in our membership is disproportionately Jewish, which obviously is not representative of wealth in the US. So about 30% of our membership nationally are Jewish identified people, along with disproportionately queer and disproportionately women. So I just want to name that because I think it's important to speak to the ways that people bring their own stake into work of social justice and into community organizing. And I will definitely share more, I think, about where that comes from. But wanted to start by explicitly naming the ways in which Jews and class impact my own experience and my work. So thank you.
Thank you. And Rachel, okay, I'm going to say Rachel K. Does that work? Okay.
That's fine. In elementary school, I was Rachel KR because there was another Rachel KI, so I'm used to this. I'd like to begin also by thanking Hasia and Hadass and Jewish Currents and all of the people who put together this event and who invited me to be part of it. I really appreciate that. I'd like to talk about my recent book, Ambivalent Embrace, in the 5 minutes I have here, which focused on American Jewish upward mobility in the middle of the 20th century. And part of what got me interested in the topic was a strange pattern that I noticed in the archives, which was that American Jews in the 1950s were much more worried and anxious about their upward mobility than I expected them to be. I knew that from the early 20th century through the 1950s, and here, Nadav, I'm going to take you up on your challenge. White American Jews of Eastern European descent went from being one of the more impoverished ethnic groups in the United States to one of the most solidly middle class. And I assumed that mid-century American Jews would have responded to their economic mobility with celebration and with patriotic myth-making. I assumed that they would use the story of their upward mobility to claim not only that America was a particularly wonderful place to be a Jew, but also that Jews made particularly excellent Americans who flourished in the land of opportunity as they achieved the American dream. And certainly when American Jewish leaders addressed the wider American public, they did exhibit a lot of this triumphalist spirit. But the conversation that took place internally within the Jewish community looked very different. So in rabbinical sermons and synagogue newsletters and in the magazines and journals and newspapers that circulated internally among American Jews, upward mobility was a much more complicated and threatening subject. Jewish leaders in the 1950s worried incessantly about how affluence would affect Jewish life in America. They doubted whether a middle-class Jewish life could ever be absorbing or engaging enough to sustain future generations of American Jews. And so what I was trying to figure out in my own research was, where did this uneasiness come from? And why did upward mobility strike so many Jewish leaders, not as something to celebrate, but as a threat, something that threatened Jewish life in America? And what I argued was that these concerns came out of a particular dissonance experienced by many upwardly mobile American Jews in the years right after World War II. On the one hand, more American Jewish families than ever were living their lives in the middle class. And along with this came greater levels of social acceptance, lower rates of anti-Semitism, and more opportunities to integrate into white Christian American society. But at the same time, many of these newly affluent American Jews continued to identify, excuse me, with Jewish histories of exclusion and poverty and violence, even as their own fortunes grew. And they thought of poverty as something integral to the Jewish experience, and upward mobility seemed to compromise, and it's something that they saw as essential to Jewish identity. Now, to be clear, no one within the American Jewish community was actually arguing that Jews should not attempt to pursue upward mobility, but rather, this ambivalence was an attempt on the part of white American Jews to differentiate themselves from the rest of the white middle class. So they used it to paint themselves as more moral and more sympathetic to outsiders and more committed to racial and economic equality than their middle class peers. And they retained this self-conception even when Jewish investments in racial and economic justice were not quite as substantial as they imagined them to be. So yeah, in my book, I tried to demonstrate how this tendency among upwardly mobile Jews to identify with Jewish histories of poverty impacted many aspects of mid-century Jewish life. And today, I'd like to argue that, 70 years later, we're still seeing this. We're still seeing middle-class and affluent American Jews continuing to be preoccupied with Jewish histories of vulnerability and impoverishment. We see this in the rhetoric of contemporary Jewish social organizations who often explain their commitments not only by citing religious ethics, but also by mentioning the history of Jewish marginalization. We see it in the ways that American Jews answered the 2013 Pew survey, where many more declared remembering the Holocaust and working for justice and equality to be more essential components of Jewish life than being part of a Jewish community or observing religious Jewish law. And we can also see it in the century-long tendency of American Jews to vote overwhelmingly for Democratic presidential candidates, in spite of longstanding and aggressive attempts by the Republican Party to court Jewish voters by supporting right-wing Israeli policy. But before one might conclude that this is a relatively harmless phenomenon, as far as phenomena go, I would like to quickly disabuse you of that notion. The continued preoccupation of American Jews with their histories of poverty and exclusion has also led some to insist that American society is a meritocracy, to downplay the history of racial oppression, and to oppose measures like, just to give one instance, affirmative action, which recognize that not all Americans begin their life journeys at the same starting line. And it's just one anecdotal example of this, and then I'll end. I just want to bring up that 2014 brouhaha that took place when a white Jewish Princeton undergraduate wrote an article insisting that his grandparents' suffering under the Nazis proved that it was his own hard work that earned him a place in the Ivy League, and not any undeserved racial or economic privilege. And his selective retelling of his family history, of course, didn't include his own experiences of being educated in schools that prepared students for college, of having teachers who assumed that he was bound to succeed, of not having to worry about food, shelter, incarceration, or violence as he pursued his education. Of course, these were not advantages shared by his ancestors, but the student was justifiably criticized for denying the challenges faced by those who didn't share the benefits of his own affluent upbringing. So I'll just conclude here by saying that along with Jewish upward mobility in the 1950s came a long-lasting communal tendency to continue to identify with the legacy of Jewish poverty. And for better and for worse, the impact of this is still unfolding.
Great, thank you. And lastly, we will go to Rachel S.
Thank you. It's so funny. I was thinking before too, like I haven't been Rachel S in a years.
It's elementary school where we're all just...
Some of us of a certain age where there were like, 10 Rachels in our classes throughout our lives. Yeah, well, so, I want to say thank you also to the organizers and participants of this. I want to just say briefly, this is a little bit off topic, but I think it's appropriate to just point to the Zoom background that I'm using, which is for the New School Labor Coalition. The new school where I work has on Friday laid off 122 staff members as part of a restructuring that is proceeding without consultation with pretty much anybody in the community, according to kind of an austerity logic that's at odds with the social justice mission of the new school. And this is an audience I thought might be interested in that. So that's why I have this bright red thing. Sorry, I also have an ambulance going by. So I just want to say, I'll say one thing about my class background. I think that's Nadav is right to raise that. Although without going into the whole thing, I'm thinking about this and realizing my own class background involves complicated narratives of mobility. On my father's family's Jewish. His, I don't know, great late 19th century, whatever father was an immigrant from Germany. And started a business that ultimately produced a lot of money My grandmother was a descendant of that line, married someone from a much later Russian Jewish immigrant family so they were poor. And my mom's family comes from kind of, not quite working class, but I would say lower middle class, and her generation has been upwardly mobile. So, it's one thing, we have to think about like, what are these narratives of mobility and at what moments do they happen? I just want to put I want to say one background thing and two maybe less backgroundy things that are a little bit more related to my work. One of them is I just think it's important to state the rise of inequality, right? I think all of us are familiar with this, but there's a big difference between the 50s and now in terms of economic inequality, particularly among white people, right? I mean, the 50s weren't as great as everybody often says that they were, but there was more equal distribution of wealth and income. I'll just say we know these figures, right? The top 1% has doubled its share of income in the last 50 years to about 40%. So 1% of the people, 40% of the income. In 2018, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, and Bill Gates, the three of them together had more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans. So they had $300 billion. That's $100 billion each. And the 165 million people that make up the bottom 50% had 250 billion. 40% of Americans are poor or low income. As Nadav indicated, the racial wealth divide is really significant. The median Black family in the US owns only 2% of the wealth of white Americans. During the pandemic, billionaires are still getting more billions, so on and so forth. So that's just a thing I want to have in the background of this conversation. Second thing, one thing I think is less talked about in this whole inequality conversation is the changing composition of the upper class, which is really relevant to this conversation, right? We used to have a kind of quasi-aristocracy. When you think of the upper class, it's like the WASP elite, old money, Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, and so on. And particularly not just white, but actually Protestants, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, as the sociologist of elites, E. Digby Baltzell, who was himself a WASP, called them. So, this is the people who belong to the social register. It's this aristocratic moment that I think most of us are familiar with. But the elite has become much more diverse in the last few decades in terms of religion, ethnicity, race, employment, class of origin, that's also the mobility point, and geography. So elites are more likely now to have accumulated their own wealth rather than to have inherited it. Although that is, of course, relative. There's still lots of intergenerational transfer of wealth happening. The rise of finance is a big part of this shift, right? So that's the second point. The third point, what goes along with this shift is a decline in the sort of aristocratic idea that this WASP upper class has what they have because they're like a better class of people and they just deserve it by virtue of their birth, right? That's the sort of the aristocratic piece. Is it used to be like you couldn't enter the upper class unless you were born into the 400 families. Now, of course, there's this meritocratic legitimation that Rachel Kay just alluded to. And that's really widespread, I think, among wealthy people and, culturally, of course, attached to this idea of the American dream and so on. So, this is it is a shift, the idea that you have to justify according to merit, and usually that merit it takes the form of hard work. But the wealthy New York parents who I interviewed for my book Uneasy Street expressed a lot of ambivalence about the sort of morality of their wealth. Not necessarily explicitly, like I think it's immoral to be so wealthy, although there are a few people who are the more like resource generation people who often tend to be Jewish, who are really explicit about that. But even people who aren't are really concerned about stigmas attached to wealth. So, it's often said like the American dream, everybody in America loves the rich, and so on. But in fact, we, just look at Trump, right? I mean, the idea that rich people are lazy, are entitled, think they're better than other people, they're greedy, they're materialistic, they're ostentatious, they're self-centered. I mean, the list of these stereotypes also goes on and on. So people who I talked with, who again were New Yorkers, cosmopolitan with elite educations, are always trying to interpret themselves as deserving what they have because they're like good, rich people, right? They're not those bad, stigmatized rich people. They work hard. They don't consume a lot. There's a kind of ironically Protestant ethic thing happening here. They're disciplined in their consumption and they're productive accumulators. And, you know, they're nice to the waiter and they give back and their kids are well behaved and so on and so forth. So in a sense, being a good, rich person comes to mean the same thing as being a middle-class person. It means having the values of a middle-class person. So there's always this kind of allusion to middle-classness, which again, may be more or less explicit. And that's one reason I think it is really important to study rich people, is the question that was raised initially, is like, these are processes of cultural legitimation that are quite extensive. It's not only rich people that are, you know, propounding these ideas about what it means to be morally worthy and when it's okay to be affluent. So that's one thing I think we really need to think about. And these people, you know, most of them think of the system as fair and think of themselves as deserving, right? As long as they behave in particular ways. And then there are people who don't really think the system is fair. And those are the people Nadav is talking about, whom I'm also doing research on right now, and among whom I actually identified myself too. You know, we can talk more about this, but those are people who are attempting to challenge the structural conditions that are benefiting them, as well as bring into discourse, as Nadav said, you know, their own class histories, their money stories, and challenge exactly the kind of narrative that Rachel just reminded us of that 2014 student, to say, no, I'm identifying all of these privileges that I have, instead of going the opposite way and identifying all the ways I might be disadvantaged, or in that case, like my grandparents might have been disadvantaged. And I'll just conclude by saying very quickly, I think that what both of you have identified in terms of Jewish people identifying this way, I've also seen that. I mean, in that sense of like, not so much like I'm a good person because my grandparents were in the Holocaust, but I understand something about exclusion and I care about excluded people because of the particular history of my own people, you know, not necessarily my individual self. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for those extremely thorough and very interesting opening remarks. So I'll try to round out the discussion a bit by asking a few questions, just to get the conversation going, and also perhaps to step back and just look at some basic definitions of what we're talking about here. So I wanted to start with a very basic question about how we define social mobility, particularly in 21st century America, right? Because we understand this notion of social mobility is sort of a moving target. And how and why does that definition vary across cultures, generations, and socioeconomic groups, right? So maybe we can start with Rachel K. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first, but I'm probably going to refer back to the 1950s because that's where I'm most comfortable in terms of my knowledge. I guess the thing that I really wanted to point out about social mobility is that it's not just about salary and it's not just about finances. There's also an aspect to it that's about identity and behavior and integrating into class-based norms. And so among my own subjects, which again, were white American Jews in the 1950s, their upward mobility was partially about increased salary, increased access to wealth, but also about the way that they came to be racialized as white people. It was also about what was a substantial Jewish migration to the suburbs. The fact that more Jewish men were moving towards careers in the profession and more Jewish women were donating their labor to the community through volunteer work instead of working for wages. So yeah, my point here is just that there's a lot that goes into upward mobility and what that means above and beyond salary alone. I'll leave it at that for now.
And Margaret, wanna?
Yeah, hi, I completely agree. Social mobility is actually a very complex topic, especially for Asian Americans, because when you look at the group itself is very diverse across ethnicity and across class as well. Most people assume Asian Americans are just very wealthy because they have the highest average income and they have highest average education. But in fact, in New York City, Asian Americans have the highest level of poverty. And when you look at, you have to look at, as I said in the very beginning, you have to look at starting points. It's good for me to hear how everybody talked about Jewish history. And I want to add a little bit about Asian American history too, that even with studying immigration, and I believe immigration across all groups, when we talk about meritocracy and we talk about who the immigrants are when they come, if they come as very poor people, more than likely their kids who are children of immigrants will probably go to school and probably do a lot better. There's no guarantee that they'll be in the upper class or the middle class, but they'll do better than what their parents did, especially if their parents did not have an education in their home country, you know, might have had an elementary education. And for a lot of the garment workers that I studied, and that was Dominicans, Mexicans, Ecuadorians, and Chinese and Koreans, that was the case. So for them, when we talk about social mobility, it is the American dream. In their eyes, you know, they come here, they work hard, they're gonna do better. And they could have faced tons of hardship. I mean, from racism to being locked out of moving into different communities across the city, being redlined, and they could be Asian American being redlined. But to them, it's still social mobility. So that's one way that we have to remember, this is the historic American mobility story. And that applies, I believe, too, to a lot of Jewish families that the Chinese families live next door to. But then more recently, we've had more Asian American families that have come that have college degrees, that have PhDs that come. And when they come here and when their kids go to college, you know, they do very well. But if we look at just, you know, in sociology term, what the father's occupation was and what their son's occupation are, there may not be huge differences, you know, but it's in their minds, they believe that they've also fulfilled the American dream by working hard and doing it. And only lately have they realized that, you know, they aren't getting to lots of places where their educational levels would say they're supposed to be getting to. Like, so for my book, the new book that I wrote, Stuck, Why Asian Americans Don't Reach the Top of the Corporate Ladder, I actually found that, and to some of them, it was a shock that it's not a meritocracy, because they really thought it would be. But when they actually looked around, they saw that there were fewer than a dozen CEOs in the Fortune 500 who are Asian American. And even in Silicon Valley, where you would think Asian Americans would dominate, that wasn't the case. For at least 5 Silicon Valley companies, 27% of the professionals were Asian Americans, and only 14% in the executive suites were Asian Americans. And you would think there would be at least a third or maybe even half from what we read in the newspapers, right? And then in law firms, this is the other shocking thing. They are the largest minority group with the highest attrition rate out of every single group, including African Americans and Latinos. So they, out of 124 in 2017 who were associates, only 14 became partners. Whereas with whites, 422 associates and 127 became partners. Likewise, with very low rates for Hispanics, 33 Hispanic associates, 5 became partners. And with African Americans, only 24 were associates, and 1 African American became a partner that year. So when we look at social mobility, we have to look at the intersections of race as well as where the starting point is too. And so those are just some other caveats, but I'll let somebody else take over now.
Anyone? I would like. I was going to move on to the next question, if that's okay. Okay, because I think we are a little bit pressed for time. But so now that we've laid out some definitions for social mobility, I guess I just wanted to ask you, why do you think it is so hotly debated, this idea of social mobility, and why it tends to generate so much discussion and sometimes what I would call class anxiety, right? It's certainly in the American context. I think, I know from my work as a journalist and in activist circles, I know that in recent years, there's been something of a backlash against the entire concept of social mobility and whether or not it should really be a policy objective or even an individual goal for, say, you know, a family across generations. people increasingly believe that it's kind of a neoliberal individualistic concept of social progress that tends to kind of reify this idea of meritocracy that might not actually exist and potentially papers over systemic inequities, and centers on this false notion that through by virtue of one's hard work, one can sort of escape poverty, right? As opposed to addressing the more systemic issues. So I guess to put it sort of to sum up, I guess, is it time to move beyond social mobility as a concept? Rachel K, I'm gonna shoot it to you again. That work?
Okay. So yeah, I've written a book on social mobility, so I'm very much in favor of retaining it as I'm very much in favor of retaining it as an analytical concept. Here's how I see it. So social mobility is a real phenomenon, right? This happens. There are communities and families and individuals who become more or less affluent over the course of a lifetime. And without the concept of social mobility to work with, we don't have the analytical tools we need to figure out how that happens and what it means to the people who are experiencing it. What I do think we have to be critical about, though, is the myth making that surrounds social mobility. So, what's problematic are myths that talk about upward mobility as, the American dream, that insinuate that every American has equal access to economic mobility. What's also problematic is praising certain groups for their upward mobility and blaming other groups for their lack of mobility without taking into account the systemic barriers that make it possible for some people to achieve or maintain that make it more possible, I should say, for some people to achieve or maintain economic success than others. And finally, I think it's also important to critique any value system that assumes that economic mobility is the only pathway to a successful life, or the only way that someone can be a valuable, valued, and contributing member of society. But that, I think, is exactly the value system that hyper-capitalist cultures encourage us to adopt, right? One that limits value to somebody who has achieved upward mobility. And that's a value system that I think is certainly worth interrogating, even if we retain the concept of social mobility as a tool that we can work with.
Great. Rachel S., do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I have something happening outside my window again, but can you hear me?
The two Rachels seem to be in the same neighborhood. They're both getting sirens.
Maybe. I actually think it might be like, sometimes it's like a Jewish holiday bus that goes by, and it may be that. But anyway, yeah, just very briefly, I kind of want to say what Rachel just said, the second part of what Rachel just said, that we have to just be really careful with the moral underpinnings of this term. And Michelle, you kind of indicated that initially. And I just want to point out too, so we tend to see mobility as an individual thing as opposed to being enabled by structural possibilities with, I think Margaret and Rachel were pointing out the kind of individual demographic, things that make you get ahead or not, but there's also the question of actual economic, growth and the mechanisms for distribution that are, so we think of like the 50s, there was all this mobility because there was economic expansion and because there were strong unions and, other mechanisms for that led to equal distribution. So that's one thing we really have to think about if we're going to de-individualize the concepts, which I think is important. And the other thing I just want to point out is that we talk about mobility, it's kind of individualistic in another way where we're talking about it as a longitudinal thing, right? Over time, usually a family, right? Immigrants come and are their children or whoever, more upwardly mobile and farther up on the ladder. But the ladder is not, not everybody can be at the top of the ladder. There's always people at the bottom of the ladder. So the question is, and again, in recent couple of decades, middle-class jobs have actually shrunk, right? We have growth at the bottom and growth at the very top. And so even whatever that sort of conveyor belt or pathway or whatever it would look like is different. But if we think about everybody, the part of the issue is making the people at the bottom actually have a reasonable standard of living and shrinking the distance between the bottom and the top. Thanks.
Nadav, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I wanted to start with like a more broad comment on social mobility and then get a little bit into particularities around Jews and Jewish communities. So I think the first thing I'll say about social mobility is that in a society where much of our economic system is still impacted by slavery and histories of extraction and continued histories of realities of extraction, it's hard for me to believe that we can actually redistribute in a way that creates social mobility or any sense of mobility for like all people, right? So I think we actually need a fundamental restructuring of how our economic system works, because right now we're in the midst of a global pandemic and that Wall Street is telling us that our economy is getting better. So we fundamentally have a problem because the ways that many people have been socially mobile is through having their money in Wall Street, right? So that we're getting two different messages about what is actually possible in terms of accumulating wealth and what is termed as like financial security. So I would argue that like the concept, like Rachel was saying earlier, of social mobility is legitimate, but the belief that it might be more possible or might grow within our current structure and system seems like a falsehood, like a farce to me right in this moment. And I think the other piece that feels important to name is like what is lost in conversation, like what is lost actually in the experiences of families and communities becoming more mobile in the terms that we think about it. Culturally, ritually, I think particularly for Jews and white Ashkenazi Jews, there was a lot that was lost through the process of suburbanization and through the process of, I think, assimilation. And it's not a simple, it was not a simple choice, or it might not even have been a choice for a lot of folks. It felt like the only option. But I think until we can imagine a world and an economic system that can benefit people and have their value be tied to them as humans as opposed to their net wealth, then that won't really change. I was going to say specifically for Jewish communities, I think another aspect of this is considering our institutions as well, right? So I think we've seen since the 50s and in the mid 20th century, a lot of Jewish institutions like federations become more well-resourced and grow. And in some ways, even parallel like systems of neoliberalism where we're trying to be more mobile by relying on private institutions and on private money, as opposed to being having our eye towards the powers of our government and the powers of public institutions and public goods. So I think a lot of what RG is trying to push is how do we build a world and a society here in the US at least where we can rely on our systems and on our government and on the public commons to give us what we need and to make mobility not actually as necessary because we all have our needs met.
Sorry, unmute myself. Margaret.
Sorry, I was just going to add one thing as we were all talking about how it's an individualistic concept, social mobility, and just kind of tie it to what people are thinking about in terms of affirmative action. There's this huge movement against affirmative action because people feel that any kind of affirmative action or holistic admissions in college or formal programs in the workplace, diversity programs that formally look at people of color or, any group, women, any group, actually is not promoting people, that they're actually doing things, promoting people who are unworthy because people aren't moving up by themselves. But in fact, if we look at things such as systemic inequalities, affirmative action and those types of programs actually address those directly. And so that's where I think a lot of the conflict comes to, especially for Asian American groups. That's why you see at least some Asian American groups who have had some access are actually fighting against affirmative action. And I just kind of, and I, you know, that happens, it's not just Asian Americans, but all kinds of groups have that. But I just wanted you to kind of focus, that's one of the things that's going on right now, using certain groups to divide and conquer, or just other, you know, concepts that we should actually think about too. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm gonna, sorry. So moving on to the next question. So I guess this is a more sort of community specific question. You know, we've collectively looked at examples of the Asian American and Jewish American communities in terms of cross-class mobility. And generally this often takes place in the sphere of educational and professional advancement, from basically from, you know, the, I guess, you know, post-war onward. And they've often been, these two groups have often been held up as examples of class mobility and meritocracy. A few of you touched on this in your opening remarks. And the term, though I kind of find it a little bit unwieldy, the term model minority is often thrown around, right, to describe the experiences of Asian Americans and Jewish Americans. And I guess I just wanted to take this question to interrogate some of these popular notions of how a community kind of ascends the ladder to the middle class, and this idea that Asian Americans and Jewish Americans have sort of, you know, made it compared to other supposedly less upwardly mobile groups, which are sometimes seen as perhaps less deserving, right? So if you could play with that concept a little bit of the model minority and where it kind of fits into your broader political analysis. So I guess we want to go with, we can go back around. Let's, Margaret, would you like to go?
Okay. I always have a problem with the unmute. Thanks. Yeah, so Asian Americans, and also I think Jewish immigrants and their children have always been seen as model minorities in one way or another. And especially now, Asian Americans are seen as the model minority, as a group that's always been able to figure out a way of how you can move up the social ladder without using things like affirmative action, without using social welfare programs. And in fact, the Asian American model minority myth comes about because of two main things. One is the high educational levels of Asian Americans in the census. I think the Asian Americans have the highest number of BAs, college degrees across the nation, and also have the highest educational level. Asian Americans also have the highest income level out of all the different racial groups. And those two things alone point to Asian Americans as being a minority group, a group of color who have been able to make it on their own, at least to achieve those two things. The third thing that's always been mentioned is that there's so many Asian Americans who go to places like the Ivy League. So for example, the incoming class at Harvard a couple years ago was 25% Asian American. And so those numbers alone indicate to other people that they've made it. If they can do it, why not other groups of color like African Americans and Latinos? And that basically is I think the underlying substance of the model minority myth. And the model minority myth, I think for a lot of Asian Americans and for a lot of other groups of color too, they don't, like I don't see myself being used to divide and being used to divide and conquer. I actually believe that that model minority is actually a myth. And as my book Stuck shows, that Asian Americans who are educated at that level are not ascending as high as people think. Asian Americans actually are what I would call a bifurcated group. If you look at the average income, why they're so high is because there are Asian Americans who are educated, who make a lot of money. But as I said before about in New York City, Asian Americans also have the highest poverty level. So when you take that average of the lot that make very, very little and the few that make a lot, you end up with an average income that's higher than the median. So that alone shows to me that that's not the case. The other thing that shows to me that's not the case is the whole thing about the education. For Asian Americans have actually done really, really well with supportive programs going into these colleges. So like affirmative action, Asian Americans in 1980 at Harvard, when I started out as a freshman, there was only 6% of the class in Asian American. And with affirmative action programs, the number of Asian Americans has gone up to 25% in the incoming class. So, I mean, I think somebody else was going to talk about model minority too. So I'll leave it at that with some of those facts. But I believe that, you know, Asian Americans right now, some Asian Americans can easily be co-opted because they believe in that myth. They believe that they are part of that myth. And some of us don't, and some of us do. And that's the discussion now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to see how members of these two communities have grappled with that notion of the model minority and to some degree perhaps have been complicit themselves, right, in perpetuating that myth because it benefits them, right? And who else does that serve, right? Whose interest does that serve, particularly when we're engaged in these really high stakes debates on affirmative action, such as the one that might be going to the Supreme Court, right? So, yeah, Rachel, do you want to? This seems to be up your alley.
Yeah, sure. There have certainly been instances in which I would argue that Jews have been complicit in perpetuating model minority myths. And sometimes this has had policy implications, and I say in particular around affirmative action, that's been the case. There's been a history of Jewish opposition to affirmative action measures, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s. Not every mainstream Jewish organization has a history of opposing affirmative action. For instance, the National Council of Jewish Women always supported it because they understood the ways that that Jewish women would benefit from them. But every other mainstream American Jewish organization opposed these measures. And these were even organizations that before that had pretty reliable records in terms of supporting civil rights measures. So this is really something of a break. Underlying that opposition was, I think, this myth of meritocracy, the feeling that if Jewish Americans were able to achieve upward mobility without affirmative action, then there's no reason why other Americans shouldn't be able to do the same. And of course, discounting all of the systemic barriers that make it easier for some groups to achieve upward mobility than others. And of course, one of the ironies of this is that white American men in the years after World War II benefited a great deal from the GI Bill of 1944, which offered educational benefits and excellent mortgage rates almost exclusively to white men who served in the military. So you could say that mid-century Jews benefited from a program that behaved in a lot of ways like an affirmative action program. It was just an affirmative action program that specifically benefited white male veterans.
Nadav, you want to say?
Yeah, I think Rachel started to speak to this, but I just wanted to name also explicitly that I think the model minority myth is very much rooted in specifically anti-Blackness and very clearly is used to tear apart relationships between Black and other people of color communities and other communities targeted by state violence. So I think it's really, really important that we center that experience and that reality. Yeah, and I think that part of our work is, and that I see at Resource Generation as well, is to explicitly be challenging these types of myths and retelling and telling new stories about our families, of stories of wealth accumulation, of the ways that their class experiences change through generations. And that also, I'll say that the class experiences don't totally negate experiences of anti-Semitism, for example, like that we can both be, that white Jews, for example, and white wealthy Jews can both be benefiting from classism and be accumulating too much wealth and be protected by that in some ways and still be targeted by anti-Semitism, particularly living through an administration that's emboldening the white nationalist movement. So I just wanted to name that because I don't know that we've gotten to that just yet, but that I think part of challenging the model minority myth is also building solidarity between among communities. And as I said earlier, like not invisibilizing the people in our communities who are coming from many backgrounds, like Asian American Jews or poor and working class Jews with mixed backgrounds. And that is part of our work, part of complicating the stories that we're telling.
Great. And Rachel S.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to share on that specifically that hasn't already been covered.
Okay, great. So we will, I think we're entering sort of the lightning round of the roundtable discussion now, because I do want to leave some time for Q&A. But let's go with, just to bring this sort of forward to the contemporary political conversation that we're all having about abysmal inequality in America and what role affluence and specifically wealthy people play in that. So in recent years, I think we've seen groups emerge that seek to promote this idea of using people's privilege responsibly, right? Sort of acknowledging privilege and also in some ways sort of embracing it in order to bring about some sort of social change or redistribution, right? So in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, a group called Millionaires for Humanity, for instance, was calling for higher taxes on the rich to specifically to aid with COVID-19 recovery at a time when Republicans have been perpetually pushing more tax cuts, right? And we also have the Responsible Wealth Project by United for a Fair Economy, and of course, Nadav's project is working in this vein as well. So I guess what I just wanted to get a sense of how you folks feel about this trend of wealthy people sort of calling on their own to pay their fair share, and what these emerging campaigns might say about our current political moment. Because if we look back to, for instance, the middle of the 20th century or even earlier, we have seen wealthy people taking some sort of social action with their wealth, right? But it's often been in the form of philanthropic ventures. And how does this new kind of discourse change that? So Nadav, I think this is sort of in your wheelhouse. So
great. Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that like traditional philanthropy is not working. It will not solve the racial wealth gap. It will not challenge the system in the ways that we need it to. Just quoting Anand Giri Haridas, who writes Winner Takes All, which is a brilliant book. He says, we, like people who are big in philanthropy, talk a lot about doing more good, but we never talk about doing less harm. We talk about giving back, but we never talk about how much these people take and the structures of taking, right? So part of what I think is powerful about the work of Resource Generation and others aligned groups and projects is to actually turn philanthropy on its head and say that in order for redistribution to work, we actually need to redistribute power as well to people, communities, organizations that are most targeted, and for them to have the power to lead our movements. And that ultimately only structural and involuntary redistribution, which looks like reparations for descendants of enslaved people, which looks like affirmative action, which looks like returning land to indigenous people. Only those solutions will be the ones that can ultimately transform our society, because people are philanthropists, traditional philanthropists are trying to solve issues with their right hand that they've helped create with their left hand, and that just doesn't work. And we have to build beyond it. So I think really what resource generation offers uniquely here is a community organizing based model where we're building power in a chapter in like a traditional organizing fashion, as opposed to just being donors. So we're much more than donors. We're actually deeply part of movements that are calling for redistribution, whether it be defunding police budgets or higher taxes.
So I think, I guess I had one more question, and I know that I see the Q&A stack accumulating rapidly. So I'm just going to end with a question that sort of puts us smack dab in the middle of this weird political moment that we're living through. Since the election is coming up in a couple of weeks, it behooves me to ask about why this conversation is relevant to current political landscape and what we've seen under the Trump administration. We have a president who is pretty shameless about displaying his affluence or supposed affluence. We're still analyzing his tax returns for that, I guess. And a broad base of people across the country from both working class and middle class backgrounds who seem to really enjoy and admire, right, this figure's persona as kind of a stereotypical New York business mogul. I would say he's somewhat of a caricature of what people think of when they think of a rich guy in New York. So the fact that we have sort of the ultimate rich guy president in the White House, what does that say about our current attitudes towards affluence and perhaps as New Yorkers or as just academics or just observers of class in America? What do you think this moment says about popular perceptions of wealth in society today and this idea of entitlement to certain individuals, as well as perceptions of the liberal elites, right, which is what Trump and the GOP are always lashing out against. And along with this backlash against liberal elites or coastal elites, right, we're also seeing, not unrelatedly, right, a surge in both anti-Semitism and xenophobia. So I'm going to throw that to the panel and see if any of you would like to just reflect on this current moment that we're living through. Rachel S., do you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, that was a lot. There's a lot of things to say. I mean, I guess I would just say, these questions about like what you just said about popular perceptions. I think there's obviously like all different kinds of perceptions of political actors and of affluence. And, we have to be really careful about making generalizations about like what we think or what, the US population thinks or something. I think, historians and others have established that this conservatives and Republicans and now the, extreme right wing have done a really amazing job at portraying, liberal elites as these bogeymen, as if the people that they're advocating were not themselves super elite, right? So that's one just really weird feature of political culture that I think, people have been talking about for, 20 years or so now. Well, it really starts, I think, with Nixon. But it's been a little bit more like in academia, I think, since then, which obviously has this massive racial dimension as well. So I think that's just something, the kind of debate about what it means to be elite is really broken, at least in terms of mobilizing that concept politically. I'll stop with that.
Right, Rachel K.
So my sense is that when Trump and his supporters lash out against liberal elites, They're specifically pointing to the people who challenge the power of white Christian men who they think should be running the country exclusively. So, I think they're specifically referring to powerful people of color like Barack Obama, powerful women like Hillary Clinton, powerful Jewish women like the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, all people that they resent for taking power away from the people that they think should have exclusive access to it. And those are the white male Christians like President Donald Trump. And so his kind of performance of power is appealing because it shows the kind of person that they think ought to have power, performing it in all kinds of ways. I think you can find a particularly good illustration of this desire to hold on to white Christian power when you hear about the recent white supremacist conspiracy theorists who've been insisting that Trump's proximity to his Jewish son-in-law like literally gave him COVID. So like quite literally weakened him. And while that accusation is as outrageous as it is bizarre, I think it illuminates something important about how Trump's supporters are trying to keep power limited to a very exclusive group of white Christian men, and how uncomfortable they feel when people without that background manage to get close to the president or achieve a measure of power through the Trump administration. So yeah, I mean, it's certainly not surprising to me that the backlash against liberal elites goes hand in hand with the surge in anti-Semitism and racism and xenophobia.
Yeah, I can add, I can see that. But that was a surprise with that comment about, I guess, Jared, I'm not quite sure what the, his proximity to, I guess, this Jewish son-in-law. So, but I do want to say that I think part of it too is the against the liberal elite, it's the liberal educated elite, because in our country, we still only have about 1/3 of our country with college degrees, right? So I think that that part of the country, the working class, the people who've been in manufacturing, that group has been left out of everything. Trump has not done anything, even though he's promised. And the whole idea of the self-made man is still there with the ideal of Trump. And that idea is expressed to that group who don't have access. So I think combined, that also fuels that image too. So, so it doesn't surprise me as well.
I mean, along with liberal elites, I think populism is another buzzword that we hear a lot. And there's sort of those kind of occupy different poles of a spectrum, but they're all sort of revolving around this sort of, real kind of divisiveness and discontent in which I think our broken definitions of elite are really having a great impact. Nadav, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I think that like folks have been saying, a lot of the rhetoric is tied up in anti-Semitism and in anti-Asian racism, and just like seeing those links and making them more palpable and clear for us in our discourse, I think will also help our movements. So I'm really invested in doing that. And the second piece I'll say, I think that maybe Rachel said earlier, was just that I think Trump is really directly tied to the growth of neoliberal and austerity politics in the U.S. Like that, he is only a continuation of our disinvestment in the public good and in the public commons, and like particularly his economic policies are nothing new. And I think it's important for us to see the ways that he's only using the system that we have designed and we have failed to challenge in order to create the chaos that he has, him and his administration has created, both in terms of racism and in terms of the increasing wealth gap and wealth inequality.
All right, thank you. And I guess I want to, that should wrap up our sort of moderated panel portion, and we have a bunch of Q&A questions. So I guess the way I'll do this is a few have been sort of upvoted to the top. So I'm just going to take the top stack of 3 questions because they're all quite different. And I'd like to give the panelists sort of their choice of which to answer. Of course, you can answer more than one if you'd like. So I'm just going to read them out in the order in which they are sort of ranked. Very democratic. So from Allison Rollman, we have this question. I would love to hear from Nadav about why he thinks Resource Generation membership is disproportionately Jewish, and more about Jewish support for involuntary redistribution, and any other comments on that. Right. And next from Ashley Pratt, we have, how did the Jewish experience correspond to and diverge from the experience of groups like Italian and Irish people as they, quote unquote, became white, right? And I think that specifically refers to sort of over the course of the 20th century, how different immigrant groups assimilated. Right? And from Andrew Thomas Gerstenberger, we have, Jewish commitment to education often gets much of the credit for Jewish upward mobility in 20th century America. Do the panelists agree that education was or is a primary enabler of upward mobility? So those 3 about Resource Generation's membership, the Jewish experience of becoming white, and the role of education in upward mobility. So I guess I can, whoever wants to go first. I guess, Nadav, there's one directed specifically at you. So
Sure. Yeah, sure. And I think Rachel Sherman might have some thoughts too on this question from interviewing RGers. Yeah, so as I said earlier in my opening, just if folks missed it, RG is definitely disproportionately Jewish. There's about 30% of members nationally are identified as Jewish, but it's also disproportionately women and LGBTQ identified people. So I just want to be clear about that. So I think part of the story here is proximity to experiences of oppression or being targeted, whether in your own experience or in how you tell your family story. I think also that because Resource Generation offers really transformative spaces and support around processing money and wealth and access in class, that can be particularly healing for Jewish people. For myself, I know that I think because of anti-Semitism and how it's functioned and the imagination of anti-Semitism in the right, that healing from conversations about money and narratives that I grew up with and many of my peers grew up with is deeply transformative. So I think those are a couple of the reasons. I would also, I think in responding to the question about education, I think there's a way to be honest about Jews' relative affluence. Like obviously we are a cross-class and multiracial community, but Jews do have some of the highest income levels in terms of religious groups in the US. And I think that comes partly because of the access to wide access to structural supports like the GI Bill in the second half of the 20th century, and that many Jews live in urban centers and have been come from a tradition that is highly literate. Like in other diasporic experiences for Jewish people, Jews have been highly literate. So I don't think there's anything, I don't want it to be an essentialist reason that Jews are better or they're more educated because they work harder. But I think there is a reality about the ways that our institutions have formed and the ways that we carry certain legacies. So those are some of my my thoughts in terms of why, both why Jews are overrepresented in RG and the question about education.
Okay, Rachel, did you want us to add something about RG or and your work in general?
Sure, you mean me, right?
Yes.
I only respond to Rachel S.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I've basically said what I was going to say, which is the thing about proximity to oppression, I think is really important. I do think it's sort of important in two ways. One is to like realize that you have an experience of oppression, but it can also be because the experience of oppression means you're not 100% privileged, and therefore it can be a little bit easier to like get into cracking open your own privilege if you have less of it. I think that's maybe a little bit less true on the Jewish angle, but I think it's more true on the sort of queer, gender nonconforming, various range of identities that people have there. I guess the other thing I would just say about, and I've interviewed people in the Patriotic Millionaires, I've interviewed, older progressive people who are not involved in resource generation. And a lot of them are Jewish too. So I think that there's two other things, which I'm not sure Nadav mentioned so explicitly. One of them is having immigrant parents, especially the older people who I've interviewed who are like in their 60s and 70s, often had immigrant parents themselves. So they are themselves mobile. And I think that having a cross-class connection, either in your social life, your political work, your job, or your family, makes people more sort of sensitive to questions of class. So that, and having immigrant family members in recent history constitutes that. And I also think that it's not just the experience of sort of exclusion or marginality or anti-Semitism or the Holocaust. It's also the long history of Jews being really active in left political movements. So, that's a history that people are also aware of and often connected to, like literally themselves as individuals, or just know about in terms of their own heritage.
I guess Margaret or Rachel K or Margaret, whoever unmutes first, I guess.
To me, the question on philanthropy was really interesting in your answers, because Asian Americans do not have that kind of history. And it's always been a question to me, why aren't they giving in the amounts that we see among the Jewish community? Part of it may have to do with their history and their relationship to philanthropy, and maybe their relationship to philanthropy even in their home country, but I'm not quite sure. And that's a question that I have in terms of, during this pandemic, I see that the Asian American community haven't come together to give even to the local communities, like in Chinatown or in Orange County in California. They haven't done the same things, or even for the centers at different colleges. So that's a question out there that I think somebody who can do comparative work should really look at it, because people are always comparing Jews and Asian Americans. And then the question on education, I just want to make a quick comment on, is that Asian Americans, it's been assumed that the reasons why Asian Americans look to education for social mobility is because historically in many of their home countries, especially East Asians, education was the only way to get social mobility. And that was through a test. But if you look here in the United States, what you'll see is that people have actually adapted. What they find social mobility is what they've actually learned. If you get a college degree, you'll do better. But many people know it's more than a test. So like the people I interviewed in my book, Stuck, they know that it's not just taking tests, not just getting good grades, but you have to become a leader in your school. You have to do all these extracurricular activities. You have to do all these other things. So it's an adaptation for living in the US. It's not something that's just culturally brought over. So it's not essential to the group. It's something that they've actually learned here. And likewise, when they move up in a corporation, it's something that they actually learn, but people just always assume that it's essential. And I do think education is a way for mobility, at least historically in the Asian American community. If you get a college degree, they do better. But a lot of parents who've come here have had college degrees. So if you look at within the family, they've pretty much stayed within the same class. But the narrative is they've gone up in mobility in the US story.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point about looking at where the family is coming from class-wise before they migrate, right? Which is often left out of our discourse about upward mobility when it comes to migrant families. But Rachel K.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what to add. I really agree with what both Nadav and Margaret said in terms of education, how we don't want to make the mistake of saying that this was somehow an essential component of the Jewish psyche since the beginning of time, right? This was a tool. This was a tool that Jews used in the context of the United States in order to achieve financial security and opportunity. And in urban contexts, they were in a position to access schools that could propel them in that direction. So yeah, in both cases, just being sure to kind of stay away from that myth making, even while we do talk about the important role that education has played in social mobility in both communities.
Any takers for the question on becoming white? I feel that if the 1950s is one of our historical touchdowns, I feel that it is important to sort of discuss that divergence, right, in the middle of the 20th century and perhaps before that as well, between the experiences of working class whites and working class Blacks and others in terms of their ability to ascend that economic ladder. But anyone?
I mean, yeah, I think it's important to recognize that in certain aspects, Jews from Europe always had access to whiteness and its privileges since the beginning of the country. That doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, all of the anthropologists along the way agreed that European Jews were white, right? Like those kind of discourses changed. But in terms of policy, Jews were functionally white in the United States from the beginning of the country. And that is not true for people who, Jewish or not, who don't trace their ancestry to Europe. So I think that's something that's really important. It's important to inflect, I think, whiteness studies with that realization.
Margaret, I know that you know, you've done a lot of work on a variety of immigrant communities. So if you wanted to add something on this idea of proximity to whiteness as a group ascends or assimilates, supposedly.
Yeah, I mean, in immigration studies, I mean, before I go that part, I want to talk about religion first. And I think religion is one aspect that even if I mean, in my view, in terms of, even if you're from Europe, religion may also color that experience as well, because both Italians and Irish are Christian. And I think religion has an aspect, as well as being from Europe. So those are the intersections that I want to mention there. But then the proximity to whiteness, because many immigration scholars also talk about Asian Americans being close to whiteness, and whether we should talk about the assimilation experience as being white and non-white. And where do Asian Americans fit in? And Asian Americans fit on the white side is what many would argue. But that's only if you kind of ignore some of the history of Asian Americans in this country. If only you look at maybe 20th century mobility, you ignore the 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act. You also ignore some of the experiences that people have even mentioned to me in the book of being redlined. You ignore systematic racism of 103 people that I interviewed, who they don't even think about their experiences as being systemic, but as individual. But only after talking to 103 of them, you realize it's actually systemic. So I think those are the kinds of things that people, many people who are researching anti-racism is beginning to realize that there is more systemic racism out there. And it's not just, I can't, the horrors that African Americans went through, I can't equate that, but there is anti-Asian racism out there as well. And I think that proximity to whiteness is a question, and we have to complicate it.
Nadav wanted to, as one more point as we close out, about the education piece.
Yes, I was just also going to say, around the whiteness piece that I think within the US context, so much of, the discourse, the narratives that are used in to fuel our society and how it works is rooted in sort of in relationship to Blackness, and that I think whiteness is constantly changing, and we sometimes forget how elusive it's been throughout US history, and just wanting to name that and to say, again, that like education and how we talk about it, I think is really important, because there are studies recently that came out that show that education, for example, doesn't close the racial wealth gap. Like education alone will not close the racial wealth gap. Access to an undergraduate degree will not close the racial wealth gap. It's really the like structural investments that are required in order to repair like intergenerational harms. So I just wanted to close with that piece.
And Rachel, did you have something you wanted to add as well?
Yeah, I just want to say one, this is a little bit random, but I'm just thinking about a piece of propaganda that I think people in this audience might want to watch, which, and some of you on the panel might be familiar with, which is a very short film by Frank Sinatra that came out in 1945, where he sings the song, "The House I Live In." Rachel, do you know that? There's it's like a little video that, probably went before of, full-length film, where he sings the song, "The House I Live In," which is written by Abraham Meeropol. And he sings it to a bunch of white, what we would now call white kids, who are like fighting with each other kind of over their what we now think of as ethnic differences. And this, and he's like, we all have this in common. We're all Americans. It's a very like, we're all white kind of thing. But part of it is like using the imagery of bombing the Japanese as a way of bringing the white kids together and talking about how their fathers helped each other in the war. And also there's no Black kids or any non-white kids in it, even though the song originally has a verse about like Black and white together. And apparently Meeropol was like super incensed that they did it without the, it's just a really precise thing about, here's what we Americans are. We're different in ways that now we don't think of really as different. But yeah, there's still some people who like don't count. So I recommend watching that. It's pretty short.
Do you use it in?
And also watch the Paul Robeson version, because that's another famous version as well.
Yeah, and I think I learned about this actually because of the documentary on Strange Fruit, which, but I don't know, which is also good to watch.
Margaret, did you have something you want to add? Okay. So I guess we're over time. This is a great discussion, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to our audience, and thank you to Jewish Currents and all the other coordinators for putting this together. This is really great, and I hope that the conversation can continue, because certainly the problems that we've all discussed here today are not going away anytime soon. So I hope today brought some clarity. Nadav says, check out resourcegeneration.org to learn more, right? And of course, you can go to the website for this event to look up people's organizations and their academic work as well. So thank you, everyone. This is great.